Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jordan Center. I'm Ann Lounsbury, Chair of the Department of Russian Slavic Studies, which is down the hall. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce Joseph Kellner, who's an assistant professor of history at the University of Georgia. Professor Kellner will be speaking about his new book, The Spirit of Socialism, Culture and Belief at the Soviet Collapse. The Spirit of Socialism looks at the multitude of new worldviews that arose in the aftermath of the collapse, when the disorientation caused by a series of crises led people to seek meaning in ideas ranging from horoscopes to the rewriting of history. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Kellner.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you for subbing in for short notice. Thank you all for coming. In the late 1970s, a Soviet mathematician, while he was studying an obscure problem in celestial mechanics, made a really startling discovery, which forces us to reconsider virtually everything we know about history before the 17th century. And I'm going to walk you through the discovery and walk you through the implications. But in order to understand it, first we have to understand a phenomenon called tidal acceleration. So the Earth spins on its axis, and the Moon much more slowly around the Earth. And the Earth rotates 27.3 times, 27.3 days per cycle of the Moon around. But that number isn't constant. The number has changed, in fact, in historical timescale. So 500,000 years ago, the day was considerably shorter because of this tidal acceleration. The way it works is, so the Moon, of course, causes the tides, pulls to itself a huge mass of water. But because the Earth is spinning so much faster than the Moon underneath it, and because there's friction between ocean and sea floor, that bulge of water is actually leading the Moon. And the water, with its own gravitational pull, is pulling the Moon faster and faster in its orbit. And likewise, the Moon, with its own gravity, pulls back on the bulge. And because of that same friction between the ocean and the sea floor, the rotation of the Earth is slowing slightly. There's a torque in the Earth-Moon system. And so every century, the day gets longer by a few milliseconds, but that actually adds up quite a bit. Every day, a few milliseconds for centuries and centuries. Now, in 1972, an American physicist named Robert Newton took it upon himself to gather a bunch of historical manuscripts. And he pulled out from those manuscripts every instance of eclipses and comets, which tend to be very reliably recorded in historical manuscripts. And so he, on a single timeline, recorded all of the celestial phenomena in all their details, and then went about comparing those dates with where we would expect those comets and eclipses to have happened and when, according to tidal acceleration. So he calculated back in time, and he raised the alarm. He said there's a major discrepancy between physical record we'd expect and these historical manuscripts. Newton found that for some reason, tidal acceleration, which should be constant, slowed down considerably in the Middle Ages, and then around the 17th century picked back up again. And he announced to the world of mathematicians and physicists, please, there's something we don't understand about tidal acceleration. There's some force that we're not accounting for, and so try to explain it. This scandal then reached our hero, Anatoly Fomenko, Soviet mathematician, with a background in celestial mechanics as well, who went about checking Newton's numbers, found them to be entirely correct. But he suggested that the problem is not with the physics. In fact, tidal acceleration works exactly as we think it should. The problem is that we've placed the manuscripts badly in time. And so if you just take all these ancient manuscripts and you move them forward by 700 years, the discrepancy is gone. Tidal acceleration behaves as it should. And all you have to do is then readjust all of our historical knowledge of the ancient period by moving it forward 700 years. And so I'll say right off the bat, not everybody agreed there was a problem to begin with. They looked at Newton's numbers, and the numbers were fine. It wasn't a critique of his physics. Somebody of his training, this is kind of trivial to do these calculations, but of his historical methods. So, Robert, how did you select the manuscripts? How do you know which ones to keep and which ones not to use? How do you know that the specific details of this eclipse or comet are recorded accurately? What did an eclipse or a comet mean to the chronicler? What did it mean to their audience? Who was the audience? How might the meaning they attach to it have affected the way they describe it? How do we know if it's direct observation or it's kind of hearsay? Are there problems of translation you're not considering? Have we placed the manuscripts right in time? Fomenko considers none of these questions, except the last one. He's very convinced that they've been placed badly in time by historians. And so he takes his findings not to the history department at Moscow State University, but rather to a bunch of other mathematicians who set about rearranging all of historical time to fit the numbers. And for 15 years, from the mid-70s through the 80s, Fomenko and his cohort of mathematicians are working on this problem, rewriting all of history. And then in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapses and the censorship regime collapses, they publish. And the first finding they announce is that there was no Mongol invasion, that it does not fit the numbers. This event never happened. Seminal event of historical memory in the medieval period gone. And then shortly after that, they declared that all of history had happened in the last 1,000 years. And Fomenko very rapidly became the most famous and popular historian in Russia in the 1990s. They sold hundreds of thousands of books, which to me implies millions of readers because purchasing power is very low. People are sharing books, people are borrowing books. He was all over the television. He was in newspapers. He was everywhere. Centerpiece of every bookstore, Anatoly Fomenko, and what they call new chronology. New chronology is the subject of the fourth culminating chapter of my book. I'm going to describe the book as a whole, then I'll return to a more detailed history of new chronology. And then in the conclusions, we'll talk about what it means about the Soviet Union and the newborn Russian Federation, what it means for us. That's a book. The book is, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody in this room, I think the first cultural history of the Soviet collapse. And it focuses on the really spectacular and visible flourishing of new worldviews and spiritual orientations and new ideas that radically break with Soviet convention that all came out of the woodwork in the early 1990s. If you were in Russia at this time, think the Hare Krishnas, think Kashpirovsky, Chumak, the TV psychics, and so forth. And so the book takes up that phenomenon. But the key context here is the crisis of the 1990s. And I'm going to assume in this crowd some familiarity with the crisis of the 90s in Russia. But a few key metrics, just to give some sense of the scale of the crisis and how I'm understanding it in the book. The Russian economy contracted by 25% in the period from 1989 to 1994. And then, which is about the same scale as the Great Depression in this country. And if we then follow through 1998, the last hyperinflation crisis of the decade, considerably larger contraction than the Great Depression. Ostentatiously corrupt privatization, of course. So the overnight minting of this class of new Russians would become oligarchs, just pillaging the treasury. Well, the vast majority of Russian people fall into very deep poverty. And with that, with a broken justice system, easily bought and paid for, government by these criminals, these newly minted mobsters, protection rackets and scams and enforcers, street crime on a very significant scale. Where's my, I'll keep that up for a second. A mafia state, essentially, is how it's often described. Probably the most striking manifestation of the economic crisis in public health So in the year 1992, 1.3 million excess deaths in Russia. That's a metric of deaths above and beyond an earlier benchmark, in this case, 1987. Those deaths attributable to homicides, suicides, and accidental poisonings primarily, so overdoses. Male life expectancy in a span of 5 years drops from 65 to 59, which is completely without precedent outside of a war, famine, pandemic. And male life expectancy in particular, because of the 3 homicides, overdoses, suicides, as well as cardiovascular disease rates, which are extremely high, stress. Now, by a lot of those metrics, Russia was comparable to many countries of the developing world at this time, but you have to consider developing from what? This is a country that, in the lifetimes of people living through the crisis, led the world into space. A country that accumulated some 20 Nobel Prizes, that competed at the top levels of international sport. A country that just 5 years ago had provided healthcare, education, housing, employment to a population of 300 million people. Now, all of those things have their own caveats attached to them. Not sustainable, but that's an academic caveat for people living through the crisis. For them, the country's been stripped of its dignity, status in the world. And there's an immense disorientation that comes with the speed of that change. Disorientation is the key word here. This includes one's sense of place. So advertising is suddenly unregulated and just plastered all over the cities that haven't changed all that much in previous decades. Pornography completely unregulated and blurring in all kinds of ways with advertising, just visual noise everywhere in your city. It includes a sense of place and time. And by that, I mean one sense of the past. So in the late 80s in Glasnost, when the press is liberalized, there was just revelation after revelation of Stalinist crimes and Soviet horrors that had been long suppressed. History teachers writing in newspapers saying, I can't believe I've been lying to my students all this time. I had no idea my own history. In 1989, the history entrance exam, the nationwide sort of university entrance exam, was just canceled because there was so much uncertainty about the past. The past had gone dark, and the future likewise. And in a crisis like this, no sense of a natural bottom, no sense that it's going to end, not just get worse. And so people are disoriented in a very deep sense. None of the foundations that they built their lives on mean anything in this world without reference points. There is nothing to fix one's life to. And that's why I call it a spiritual crisis. There's no big picture that anyone can really find. And so it's in that context, the spiritual crisis, disorientation, that we see what I call the seeking phenomenon, this period of really frantic seeking for new ideas, new orientations, new big pictures. And what will be behind my slides. The advance guard of this phenomenon was the unheralded appearance on Soviet TV of 2 television psychics. This is Anatoly Kashpirovsky. He had a kind of rival in Alan Chumak. Both of them appeared in 1989 on the television doing seances, healing various ailments, and drew audiences approaching 150 million viewers, which half the population, doesn't mean everyone believes what they're watching. Many of those people are just shocked to see something so peculiar on TV, or shocked that their neighbors believe it, or whatever, their mothers. But huge attention to these 2. And then it turns out, following them, wave after wave of preachers and prophets and proselytizers and mystics and mystical pyramid schemes and totally unconventional visions of science and of history, new chronology among those, all at once, and marking the culture of the time very deeply. People's memories of this period think the Hare Krishnas, I say the book is about Hare Krishnas, and everyone immediately understands the people who lived through this period. And so the book takes up these seekers as a whole. It's based on oral histories. I interviewed different people who were involved in the seeking, leaders of these movements. And I chose 4 case studies. Highly visible, memorable, popular movements, currents within this milieu. The first one was, the first chapter was on Soviet astrology. The second on the Hare Krishnas. The third on apocalyptic sects, and in particular the Assyrian sect. This guy, Siberian mystic, claims to be the second coming of Christ in 1990. He was like one of 3 second comings of Christ in 1991, but he is the one who established a significant enough movement and a migration out to Siberia. They built a new Jerusalem in the taiga, and they're still there. And so I was able to go there and interview them and move with the sectanti. And finally, Anatoly Fomenko's New Chronology. And each of these chapters is a history of the given movement from the Soviet 1960s onward. And I asked 2 questions of these movements. First, why these specific things? Why these and not other ideas? And this is how I construct my understanding of late Soviet culture. Looking at what seemed plausible and what seemed credible to these former Soviet people, and then in the Soviet underground, and then millions more when they are allowed to be out on the streets. So for instance, the astrology chapter begins in the space age, this conflation of science and faith that accompanied the space age, and then follows several hard scientists, astronomers, mathematicians who become astrologers in the Soviet underground, and then become astrological celebrities in the 1990s. The Hare Krishnas have their roots in the Soviet-Indian relationship and the huge emphasis that the Soviet state put on India and Indian culture. And then the second question is, why the seeking generally? Why did this phenomenon happen at all? What are people seeking? What do they share in common? And I'm going to return to that question at the end. History of new chronology. And this history too begins with the cult of science in the Soviet 1960s. Space age, the age of science fiction, the glory days of Soviet progress. And this here is Moscow's monument to the conquerors of space. Starbound rocket, perched on this massive titanium contrail, and this poem is written at its base. And thus rewarded are our toils, that having vanquished lawlessness and darkness, we forge flaming wings for our country and our age. The poem has a dual meaning. Now, in one sense, this is the Marxist idiom, lawlessness and darkness, the obscurantism and ignorance of past centuries, past epochs, illuminated by Soviet reason and science. That much is clear. But the lawlessness and darkness here also quite clearly refer to the immediate past, to Stalinism, to the arbitrary and irrational violence that impeded socialist progress in the era just nipping at the heels of Khrushchev and his. No living politician appears on the side of, there's 2 big stone reliefs on the side of this monument that had been outlawed. Instead, the rocket is flying over workers, of course, cosmonauts, but mostly scientists, engineers. There's a computer scientist who's holding a strip of perforated tape. These are the heroes of the era. The prestige of the scientist at this time was to surpass that of the party leader. In the pantheon of the era's heroes, Soviet and Russian scientists stood shoulder to shoulder with Galileo and Copernicus, whose official persecution was the surest sign of their greatness. And in addition to their political clout, Soviet scientists also seized the mantle of art at this time. Soviet scientists were the best artists too. And this was as it should be. The entire purpose of scientific progress, once you decouple it from the profit motive, was to leave humanity to its creative devices. And that included, of course, ever more amazing scientific breakthroughs. No coincidence, the most venerated genre, the most popular genre of the time is science fiction. But even more directly, the science itself is an art. It's an act of creation and of inspiration. Modern scientists' feat is completely arcane. It's just summoned in the frenzy of formulas and figures, and then just announced to the public in a press release. And so the scientist, in short, was unchallenged in his cultural supremacy at this time. And it was typically his. He was lionized by the state, but he also stood for objective truth against human arbitrariness, including political arbitrariness, admired by the intelligentsia. And where he's resented, it's not for the lack of art, but because his art might be superior. And at the height of the space age, it really was. At that time, the scientist's confidence was the confidence of the country, because he embodied the end goal, human creativity towards benevolent ends, and he was leading the masses in that direction. Or more accurately, the scientist was simply following reason, following the numbers, and the masses followed him. That was progress. That's the asymptotic curve of the titanium contrail. Science is leading upward, and humanity close behind. And this is the world that fostered Anatoly Fomenko. Fomenko, from a very young age, showed remarkable gifts in mathematics and in drawing. He finished his whatever studies before college a year in advance. He skipped a grade. He was provincial. He was actually grew up in Magadan, but he, through the system that the state had built to extract the best scientific talent, finds his way to Moscow State University. He finishes his undergraduate in the mathematics department there. And Moscow State University, I should say, arguably the greatest concentration of mathematical talent on earth at this time. Fomenko, skips a year, finishes his undergraduate, goes right into graduate school, and receives his doctorate at the age of 24, which is about as young as you can do that. And the Soviet doctorate is certainly more work in this field than the Western equivalent. So he is launched into the faculty at MGU. At the age of 25, he is giving a keynote speech at a major international mathematics conference. And his field is topology, which is the mathematics of complex surfaces. Fomenko is the guy in the poster. He stands as a paragon of the Soviet scientific elite and of Soviet scientific culture, including the fact that what he does is completely impenetrable. In trying to understand his persona and preparing this chapter, I thought I would try to, do topology 101, and there is no topology 101. It's like there's no way to access this without very significant education in math beforehand. But Fomenko, entirely fittingly, is also a talented visual artist. And here I had a little more luck understanding the man and his self-perception. This is some of his art. All done in pen and ink. These are illustrations that Fomenko drew for a major textbook that he produced with some of his colleagues in topology. And Fomenko has spoken a lot about his art. And in his descriptions of his artistic process, we can see how deeply he assumed the mythos of the Soviet scientist. And he describes his artistic process this way. Fomenko claims that he sits down in front of his canvas, no plan in advance, and he just enters a state of vigorous mathematical intuition, loses himself completely, and then breaks through from this mundane world of ours into a world of pure mathematics, where the complex surfaces and figures that we see in these pictures exist before him. And because of his training and his rarefied talent in this field, he is able to fly across these fantastical landscapes, see them from all sides. He says, like there's a camera in his mind. He is collecting information about these forms in front of him. And when he reaches some critical mass of information, the artistic work is simply born. He says he never erases a mark. And when he snaps out of it finally, he stands back, astonished, like everyone else, at what is before him. Now, whether he erases a mark, obviously irrelevant. A lot of self-mythologizing here, probably. But what matters is the world here that he's depicting is real to him. That this is a real existing mathematical place. And that he renders himself just an observer, just a translator who can convey this world to the waiting public. He claims it's the same method in mathematics. He says that he will wake up with the solution to a complex proof in his mind and just record what has appeared to him in a dream. And by all evidence, he uses this exact same method in history with absolutely astonishing results. So to recap what we've learned, tidal acceleration. Problem of tidal acceleration that the numbers somehow are not matching up with historical records, celestial phenomena, which Fomenko solves by eliminating the Middle Ages and moving the classical period, the ancient classical period on top of the Middle Ages. Now, this evolved from the 1970s to through the 1980s into a fully realized historical school inside the mathematics department at Moscow State University. And their work is based on a vast mapping project that they call the Global Chronological Chart. This is one of 6 timelines, and I'll give you a little more detail. These mathematicians distilled historical manuscripts to their numbers as they understood it, and developed a system of colors and shapes and textures to represent different kinds of historical phenomena. So a dynasty, a war, an assassination, all of these put on the same timeline with the intention of seeking what they call isomorphisms, basically repeating units of history that you can now visualize. And remarkably, a lot of them look exactly the same. And so they set about cutting history into repeating units that they think historians have accidentally separated in time. And the final conclusion is, if you take the pre-classical ancient period and you move it forward by 1500 years and you drop it on top of the Middle Ages, and you take the classical period, 1,000 years or so, and then late antique, early Middle Ages, and move those some 400 or 500 years forward, they stack on top of each other into a single condensed 1,000-year timeline, and they're exactly the same. And so, in fact, all of human history was just 1,000 years old, and historians have made gross errors in separating these events into disparate periods and places and times. Based on manuscripts that none of them can read. But here we get into the implications. It doesn't matter that they can't read the manuscripts, because it turns out that Russian translations of the manuscripts are fine, because all of them were originally written in Old Church Slavonic, which was the universal language of the world in the early medieval period. And so basically Russian, and they can just read it as if it is their own language. This detail here I'll return to, but this is maybe 1/100th of the whole chart. And this just happens to be the one where Jesus Christ is in the 12th century. The life of Christ there in red. Now, all of this has some implications for our understanding of the past. And I'm going to walk you through the reconstruction, as they call it. Like I said, first, there's no Mongol invasion. Whoops. My Mongol picture is gone. No Mongol invasion. In fact, the invasions of historical memory were just minor skirmishes at the outskirts of a vast, forgotten Slavic Turkic great empire, which ruled all over the entire known world from the 14th to the 17th century. The skirmishes that we remember as the Mongol invasions were actually quite minor, and they involved the Khazars, who were actually the same people as the Cossacks. They were the guards of the Khan, but the Khan was the same person as the Tsar. And the capital in Karakorum was actually in Yaroslavl, but at the time they called it Novgorod, Central Russia. And broadly, they rewrite all of history to center on the rise and fall of this great empire. So history begins in the 10th century when writing first emerges in the city of Alexandria, which is the same city as Rome and the same city as Jerusalem. It then tracks the ascent of the Slavic Turkic great empire, which lived in a state of ethnic and religious harmony with a single shared religion, Christianity. And then rules well, peacefully, till about the 17th century, when the unifying Christian faith begins to schism. And this is when we see the emergence of Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, all of them descended from this initial Christian faith. And this being the Middle Ages, not far downstream from the religious schism is the political fracturing of the empire. So by the end of the 17th century, the great empire is broken up, and the throne is usurped by the Romanovs. And the Romanovs set about with their Western collaborators, German monarchs in particular, obscuring everything I've just told you, burning documents, erasing the history of the great empire in order to legitimize their claim to the throne, which we now incidentally confuse with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. All of this published in 1990 with the imprint of Moscow State University on the spine book. Eventually they stopped doing that, but the first one was Moscow State University on the spine. And like I said, massive fame across the Russian Federation. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, millions, either came to believe or grew agnostic on the question, said, I don't know. This is a guy with extremely impressive credentials, and he never hesitated to play up his credentials. There was no historian who came to Flamenco's aid. In fact, there was a backlash, a very loud outcry of historians who formed a formal anti-flamenco movement, anti-flamenco conferences, anti-flamenco volumes with essays, some of them very amusing essays, all meant to prove, among other things, that Jesus did not walk the earth in the 12th century, that there was a Mongol invasion and so forth. But nobody listened. Nobody cared what these historians were saying. And the reason is, like I said, in the 1980s, the historical profession had been extremely denigrated by this wave after wave of revelations. It appeared to the average person that historians didn't know anything about the past, certainly history teachers. And the shorthand for this was that they were involved, complicit in Soviet whitewashes and cover-ups. Just as often they didn't know, just as often this is a complete mischaracterization of what historians do. But Flamenco won every time. Nobody cared what the historian said. He dispatched this opposition very easily. And in fact, the opposition only made him look more like Galileo Copernicus. It became part of his mythos that he had revealed something so shocking that historians simply could not handle a scientific discovery on this scale. So what does new chronology mean? You've seen why people believed it. The author is this paragon of Soviet culture, including his persecution. His story is kind of a cultural archetype, and there are here enduring Soviet values. Through the 1990s and in all of these movements, the prestige of hard science endures. There's a lot of respect for what he does, for his credentials, even though you can't understand it, and reading the books does not illuminate very much. Flamenco followed the numbers and people followed him. So that's why people believed. But that's a separate question for why people read it. So what are people actually getting from this? Why, even if it's true, why read it at all? And the common explanation, the common answer here, is that Flamenco is some kind of mystic nationalist and obscurantist, spinning medieval fantasies in service of a new Russian imperialism. That's interesting. Virtually all English language studies come to the same conclusion. Flamenco answers some society-wide search for the Russian idea, and his answer is a kind of nationalist identity. This is not untrue, but it's not the whole picture. I think there's more to it. On the face of it, absolutely. Flamenco's theory glorifies Russia, establishes its place as the dominant historical power of the world, not just its region. Although he doesn't call it Russia, it's Slavic Turkic. He's definitely not ethnically defined. He's very adamant about that. Old Church Slavonic is a universal language. Western power is implicated in conspiracy. So you see the outlines clearly of a nationalist fantasy. But in fact, Flamenco also never hesitates to undermine key pillars of Russian nationalism. Take, for instance, the Mongol invasion. Seminal event of the Russian Middle Ages. To some nationalists, it's a national humiliation, whose response comes in imperial power. It's sort of the justification for the centralized state. Other nationalists say, no, it's actually more pride. This is what sets Russia apart from Europe. It is our steppe history, our steppe heritage that allows us to resist, market-driven decline in values, everything we hate about the Western liberalism. Russia's different because of the Mongol invasion. Well, Flamenco says it just didn't happen. And it's very hard to square that. It's hard to know what that means, ultimately. Flamenco is kind of ambivalent on the Jews, anti-Semitism. If there's ever a consistent current in Russian nationalism, he's not really clear. And in any case, he doesn't pay a lot of attention to that question. Not interested in it. Some of his collaborators are Jewish, for what that's worth. But returning to Jesus in the 12th century, in addition to locating Jesus in the 12th century, he also has the Old Testament written after the New Testament, and the New Testament written before the life of Christ. In other words, the Russian Orthodox Church hates Flamenco. They spend a ton of time trying to destroy new chronology and discredit Flamenco, central pillar of Russian nationalism these days. It has nothing to do with Flamenco. And maybe more essentially, there's no nationalist movement that adopts Flamenco. And in the early 90s, there was really widespread political fatigue. People were not invested in politics. People were disgusted by politics. The solutions that people are looking, the orientations in the world, they're not political in nature. And I think that's the same with Flamenco. The theory is open to much wider interpretation. And so rather than seeing it as some prologue to Putinism, I think that it makes the most sense in the context of the spiritual seeking of the time, in the seeking phenomenon. All of the different cultural currents of this period, astrologers, Krishnas, the apocalyptic sects, TV psychics, they can't be reconciled intellectually. They're incoherent. And people, in fact, are building their own syncretic worldviews. They're not subscribing to one idea or another. There's a very esoteric kind of mood about this seeking. Any idea is worthwhile, any idea that's interesting or novel. So what they share aren't answers, but questions. It's the driving questions of the era. And all of these groups are illuminated by the same questions. All the ideas in circulation are signposts by which people are navigating the questions raised by the collapse. And so I group these into three categories, three basic questions people are so fixated on. First, questions of epistemic authority, intellectual authority. Who can I believe? Where does actual knowledge and truth derive? Flamenco has his answer, and it's a very compelling answer. It is hard science, the hardest hard science, mathematics. People find that compelling. And generally, like I said, science remains a very sturdy pillar of the culture at this time. But who gets to define it is increasingly up for grabs. Astrologers show the same thing. The second question is of identity, which in the Russian context often takes the form of East versus West. Where does Russia belong in the world? Where should we be orienting ourselves? And Flamenco has his nationalist implications for sure, never consistently, but people were looking everywhere. Western esotericism, Buddhism, the Japanese, that whole Shinrikyo has a huge following in Russia at this time. There's just, people are grasping all over the world for new ideas. And then finally, the third question is about historical time and its direction. The nature of time. Every chapter of the book finds the same fixation. Where is history headed? What is our place in it? What is the big picture? Astrologers take comfort in the cyclical vision of time. This too is going to pass. It's all written in the stars. There is nothing to be shocked by or to be afraid of. Hare Krishnas seek a nostalgic return to a Vedic golden age. It's very nostalgic and very conservative movement, surprisingly. Bessarion, of course, the sex, a rupture and rebirth, an apocalypse followed by the union of heaven and earth. All these different visions of time. Now, what does it mean? This kind of dramatic fraying at the end of Soviet time. Soviet time is just led nowhere and goes in all these different directions. New chronology, most explosive of all, a new shape of time. And to me, it seems that the shape and the direction of time is the deepest assumption about the world that finally gives way in crisis. The essence of spiritual crisis is this disorientation of time. Marxism, certainly Soviet Marxism, was a vision of time. The upward march of progress, the curve of that contrail. But by 1989, it had ended nowhere in particular. The Russian Revolution had answers to all three of these questions. Epistemic authority, identity, the direction of time. And the answer was science and reason along distinctly Western lines would lead humanity upward unto perfection. The revolution raised these questions, but its failure meant that the questions were still unresolved. In the 1990s, they come up again. So in the narrow sense, this is the final abandonment of the failure of Marxism, Leninism as a worldview. But it serves to remember that Marxism, Western liberalism, came of the same time and place historically. They share a much broader conceit of the 19th century. What happens in Russia in the 1990s is the end of a much longer Western arc. That is the story of progress generally, shared by Marxists and liberals, the story of European modernity. That the future was self-realization of the individual, scientific enlightenment, technological progress, global integration, and most of all, that the future was something to anticipate with hope. The USSR took up this mantle most spectacularly, most explicitly, claimed the forefront of history, And this is not really a story of Soviet failure entirely. They succeeded in so many ways. The Soviet Union wrenched the old Russian Empire out of an extremely backward state and produced modern people, urban people, middle class, well-educated, reverent of science, reading history in their spare time, optimistic about the future. And I should have said, the people, the seekers here, these are highly educated, they're urban people. This is the technical intelligentsia by and large, the Soviet mainstream. And by the 1990s, nobody could believe that history led anywhere in particular, in Russia, obviously. And it's precisely these people that diverge from the supposed modern path. Or rather, the path tapers off under their feet. And by the time they realize it, there's no hope of finding their way back. And it's the seekers who are the first to then look up and orient themselves anew. Now, looking at our own world today, which I'll only do briefly, but we can talk about it. It almost goes without saying that this is not just a story of Russia. Conspiracy theory is a primary mode of discourse in this country now. Reactionary nostalgias are cropping up all over the West. Virtually nobody anticipates the future with hope. And so with Russia, as so often, just the most dramatic case, and maybe the first through the gate. But I think this is an image of our era generally, which just comes to a really extraordinary head in the early 1990s in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Floor is open to questions, and we have questions online too, right, Sasha?
Yeah. You can use the raise hand function. That's the easiest way for us to get to your questions, and we'll call on you and ask you to unmute.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
First question. Okay, what year did you move here to United States?
I was born here.
You born here.
This is all.
So you never been there.
No, I was not.
You've been there, but you never lived there.
Yes, and this is, I was born in 1987, and so this is entirely reconstructed. And it is only now that historians are taking this period as a historical period. It takes about 30 years before we're ready to call it history. And so we're piecing this together from interviews and from archives. In fact, the Bakhmantiev archive has a collection that Elliot Bornstein himself gathered of pamphlets and leaflets from all these groups on the streets and those sorts. But yeah, I was not here. First time I went to Russia was in 2007.
Okay. Only question or also comments?
Please. Oh.
Okay, I actually was in the Soviet Union or in the former Soviet Union during 90s. I came here like in mid 90s. And among intellectuals, nobody took seriously Fomenko.
Absolutely. This is not the true sort of cultural intelligentsia. This is the readers of Fomenko, although I will say with these other groups, it's much easier to find who the members were in sociological terms. We don't really know who's reading Fomenko. I think that the crowd was more provincial and less, the scientific technical intelligentsia who were more active among the astrologers and but they were sort of the urban mainstream, not the cultural elite, certainly or the intellectual elite. Yeah, and certainly not the historians. I mean, not a single historian. Fomenko claims that here and there, some historians will say on the side that he's right, but they can't say it out loud. I don't necessarily believe him. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious to hear more about how you chose these 4 case studies, or whether there are other movements, other places, these people you described as seekers, and whether your choices would make intuitive sense to sort of the people you're interviewing or not. I'm just sort of curious to hear more about that selective.
Very good question. The organization of the book and the case studies emerged organically from the research. And so the research method was just to meet as many of these people as possible and to interview. And I have piles of interviews with, Mormons, for instance, and other groups that were in circulation at the time. But from following the networks, basically the same way that these people did, jumping one person to another, reading what they're reading, the 4 groups I picked I picked for, first of all, their kind of radical departure from Soviet norm, from familiar norms, which I say primarily to say that this is not about orthodoxy. So Russian orthodoxy, I put in a separate category, and I describe in the introduction why that is, but it's not part of this larger seeking phenomenon. And for a lot of people, it's more of a cultural identifier. The church is not experimenting at this time in any way. But astrology, Hare Krishnas, these sects and new chronology, to me represent there's a familiar resemblance in all of them, in all of these groups together, and these are sort of standout figures within that family. And they all contain elements of the others, and they overlap in all kinds of ways. But they touch on different themes, and they seem to me to round out a fairly good picture of the phenomenon as a whole. There were also some less intellectually rigorous reasons. There were groups that were really difficult and unpleasant to work with. Scientology was very successful in this period, but they're sort of infamously paranoid and vindictive towards people that research them, and so I just gave up, and I was not going to. And the Jehovah's Witnesses too were successful but difficult, and they have a different history in this period. But it's hard to get past the PR people. They have spokespeople, and so these are also groups that were welcoming enough to talk to me.
Thank you. This was really fantastic. Since you interviewed a large number of people, I wonder about the different directions and trajectories they had, after this period of the late 80s and 90s, when they, in the process of seeking arrived at the truth. Did you come across apostates and
there's definitely a self-selection here. So the people I'm talking to were more deeply invested in a lot of others. So a lot of people, everyone was reading horoscopes, but only some people are making it sort of key part of their worldview and their understanding. And those are going to be the ones that I'm talking to. There are people who are still in the Hare Krishna temple in Moscow. All of these movements fade. I mean, by the end of the 90s, this moment has passed, and I don't have a completely rigorous explanation, but I do think that there's revolutionary dreams by Stites. There's this picture of the 1920s in Soviet Union, this utopian dreaming where there's all these different currents and visions of the future. And then Stites kind of frames Stalinism as utopian in its own right and sort of selective of these currents, which are then condensed into a single dogma of a type. And I don't know if we can apply this to Putinism. I'm not going to. The book doesn't mention Putin. It doesn't go there, but there is a lot of these currents still exist in some form or another. There's still a lot of New Age beliefs and so forth, but they are sort of one at a time. Excuse me. Stamped out. The Orthodox Church plays a big role in that. So the church has an anti-cult movement where they're crushing these groups where they can. And the masses and the public spectacle of it by the later 90s just kind of fades. I think, again, people who lived through the period remember it as a distinct and surprisingly short period. But all of these questions, the questions I raise, have kind of been answered by Putinism in its own way. There is now a more coherent and single vision of what this country is and what it means. And so those things coincide. I don't know if it's cause and effect, but they coincide. Brent?
Thank you very much. I'm curious about how the world outside of Europe looks like for flamenco, because everything that you mentioned is pretty centrally, Europe, Eurasia, so I'm wondering, Africa, rest of Asia, Western Hemisphere, they exist for him in any meaningful.
They exist, and when they need to keep publishing, they eventually will do a book on Japan, a book on the New World. They're certainly not central, and the Great Empire covers the bulk of the Eurasian landmass. I don't know specifically about Africa. So a lot of his books come out later and he continues to publish them. And so the chapter is based largely on the ideas as they were forming in the 70s and 80s and the earliest publications, which were focused mostly on the Soviet world in Eurasia. But he does have theories about the New World. And at some point it becomes, if you can believe it, kind of boring. because the task, he's so certain of the basic premise that all this history happened in 1,000 years that he just starts layering kind of other histories on top of it. And they're all the same. But yeah, he's definitely interested most of all in Northern Eurasia.
At the risk of this becoming like us asking you about all the things that are wrong with Fomenko's ideas, what does he do with the material record? Like, what does he do with archaeology? I mean, that's a scientific.
Yeah. So Fomenko is not overly impressed with radiocarbon dating. He is not impressed with numismatics, dating by coins. Dendrochronology is pretty flawed in his view. And so he has specific papers dedicated to all of these things, which I invite you to read. But essentially, he thinks, or he frames it as though all of those methods, all the same, depend on the historian's timeline. And so he can very easily dismiss any kind of material record. And he's never traveled and done any sort of research outside, so he thinks there's no point because the way you get at truth is the numbers, and that's how what he's done. But people write him letters all the time, he says, and he still has, unfortunately, I interviewed him for the book, but he doesn't archive the letters, which I wanted so badly. I mean, to have thousands and thousands, there's piles of letters. He still gets mail all the time. And people from different corners of the Soviet Union writing him and saying, you know, there's this archaeological site here in whatever Khabarovsk, and it's exactly like you say, and so forth. But he doesn't keep those. So, yes.
Yeah, I have a question that I guess is about methodology. I mean, it's completely wonderful that you were able to interview all these people, and in some sense, it's an ethnography in a way, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm, as a person who has to work with texts, because I work in the 19th century, I'm just wondering, what would a history of this period look like with just texts? Like, what would you have found? I assume you read a lot too, just.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, half the research is reading their texts, absolutely, and
Yeah.
sort of so, you know, read the Bhagavad Gita and read sort of astrological books that they were using in the
Yeah.
underground and so forth, as a way to understand. And I try very hard to take seriously these movements on their own terms and understand what they believe. But the interviews are most effective because to me, so let's take, for instance, conversion narratives get a ton of attention in oral history, literature, and theory, because they're completely unreliable as sources. Because what happens is when you convert, we think of conversion in kind of Paul on the road to Damascus, a single individual flash of light, and one person finds the truth. But it's completely untrue. The nature of conversion is always social and collective. And so these Hare Krishnas, or any of them, as they join a certain movement, they get the language to describe their conversion from everyone else. They reconstruct their previous life to lead towards the conversion. I mean, everything is distorted around the point of conversion. But what it does reveal is what they found credible. And so, for instance, a lot of the Hare Krishnas try to explain in scientific terms why the Vedas are the oldest possible text, why historians cannot date, you know, these things in time because they're so deeply ancient. They're essentially original human culture. And from that, you get a sense of how they were kind of convincing each other and what they found to be meaningful and plausible in the doctrine. Because the actual Hare Krishnas don't argue in that way. The Soviet Hare Krishnas do. They're very invested in showing that, no, this is scientifically legitimate. A lot of them are scientific intelligentsia again. Although a lot of them also come out of Vostochogenia and kind of the humanities stuff. And so their own, what they find plausible, what they find credible, and how they justify their belief is really revealing. And that comes out in oral histories. I haven't considered, I mean, you could certainly write this history without them, but it would look.
I mean, I'm glad you didn't have to.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about what it would look like.
Yeah.
Without
I mean,
these
I can say the most interesting kind of textual research in history is by finding these texts and reconstructing how these groups in Soviet underground, so in the 70s and 80s, this all begins kind of in the dissolution 70s and 80s, and how they networked and how they exchanged texts. For instance, you would get a friend who has access to the Spetskhran at the London Library who can get into foreign texts and things that are not publicly available. And then they would use the circulation slips to find who else is reading these texts. And they would make networks based on the circulation slips of who else in the city is into astrology. And so you can figure out the networks in a really detailed way. And where, if you have a friend with a foreign passport, they would go to Bulgaria and they'd come back with any kind of astrological text they could find. And so you see the social world of seekers, and that's strictly from sort of the textual evidence.
Yeah.
And that's part of the video. Yes.
Thank you. I almost see this as kind of this like new, an additional branch to like post-Soviet Russian conspiracy studies, in the sense that like, I always feel like there's this propensity, especially after the collapse, like towards conspiracy, which obviously like we see with nationalist policies today. But what I'm wondering is, I mean, I can see why people would be interested in Hare Krishna or, I don't know, in astrologers, but what was it exactly about Flamenco's policies or his ideas that compelled so many people? Like, obviously, we know like the vulnerability of the collapse, etc. But like,
Yeah.
what was it like at its core? Like, was it the nationalist component, or like, how was it so compelling?
I'll say it's hard to tell because you don't know who the readers are. That's the one, I wasn't able to do this sort of oral history with readers of Flamenco because you just don't have to find them. But what I think what to me illuminated it is that the key questions that the text seems to raise are the same as these other groups. And I think that people were reading it as sort of in a pile of other readings gathered in their kitchen krushki or whatever, talking to their friends. And sort of the more novel and more radical an idea was, the more interesting it's just something to talk about. And with that, with his sort of credibility and his credentials, it was so stimulating and plausible enough. Now, you're right that another element of the attraction is the kind of detective story that drives his narrative and the conspiracy behind it. And so how did this possibly get obscured? And the longer he writes and publishes, the more he focuses on kind of the cover-up and the nature of this being a revolutionary scientific discovery that has been kind of obscured from humanity. And so that part, in a culture where scandal and cover-ups are also have a ton of currency in media and stuff, that is also really appealing about Flamenco for sure. Yes, behind you.
So I was wondering, like growing up, I remember listening to like adults talking about Flamenco, often in relation to their Gurulov theories.
Yeah.
But I never really looked at it or researched it. So I was wondering, and I know a little bit about the Gurulov theories and how they were also by official Russian historiography history, they were considered kind of conspiracy theory adjusted or something. And I was wondering if there is any connection. I know that Gurulov died in 1991 or something, but is there any connection between Gurulov and Flamenco?
Yes, it is intentionally obscured by Flamenco. So Lev Gumilyov was he's an anthropologist. He was an academic and an intellectual who had this very idiosyncratic theory of ethnogenesis, and essentially a kind of parascientific idea about sort of the energies of different ethnicities which would rise and fall across Eurasia. And there was an explanation that had this element of sort of ethnic universalism, and it was definitely in the camp of Russians are people of the steppe, and he was very interested. He used Turkic sources and Indian sources for his research. Flamenco, part of his self-presentation is as kind of this lone genius. And so I think he greatly understates the influence of Gumilyov. He says that he had some interactions with him, wrote Gumilyov some letters. Gumilyov wrote him back and said, I can tell that you're right about this, but again, I can't say it out loud. And I, all of that, I just, essentially just deleted from the transcript because it's all many years on and not very plausible. There are significant differences. I mean, the Eurasianism generally is probably the closest touchstone here to understand Flamenco, although it is incoherent, and he is definitely, the Eurasianists become much more anti-Semitic much faster if you dig into that ideology than Flamenco does. And so there are key ways that he doesn't follow that. And he also, the Eurasianists are much more humanistic in sort of their methods and their framing. And they don't have this Fomenko's, hard science. And I should say he does the astronomy stuff, and also he has totally bizarre theories of linguistics that he also uses to prove these things. The best I can say is that Eurasian was definitely in the ether. It was definitely in the circles he was in, and clearly has some influence on his vision. But I would not go so far as to call him a Eurasianist. And I kind of get into the weeds maybe too much in a book about this, because I think that's the easiest way to say, oh, he just belongs to this existing school. I think he's doing something different, but clearly has read Galileo and been influenced by Galileo. Yes, please.
I found this completely fascinating. I guess I have one question. I just was a little unclear about the maybe temporal horizon of your argument, because on one sense it seems to close, which makes sense. It kind of closes by the late 1990s. And at the same time, I don't know how explicit you are about this in the book, but you kind of also at least gesture at the notion that we're all living in this world now. So I just wonder if you could think through that.
Yeah.
And then I have a second question, which is maybe unanswerable. I guess it's a question for you as a cultural historian. Because so much of this is resonant of England in the 1650s, execution of the king in 1649, and just this explosion, for basically 10 years, explosion of worldviews that were previously kind of unthinkable. And there is a kind of similar temporal horizon to that, or sort of a curtain seems to fall on those ideas of ranters and diggers and Mogultonians and so on. So I wonder if you've done any, and you've mentioned the 1920s, so I just wonder if you've thought about kind of horizons of possibility after moments of historical ruptures.
Absolutely. And that is one thing that I didn't pursue. I discuss it in the introduction, but I did not pursue sort of comparison, the comparative study of this type of phenomenon, which I think would be extremely interesting. I mean, for an American audience, the 1960s are clearly the parallel that we draw. And it is a recurring phenomenon. There's no question that there are, in moments of crisis of one kind or another, moments of disorientation, you see this cultural response. But it's very difficult to find patterns. So it's not just the economic crisis. I mean, if you think of, so there was nothing like that in the 1930s in this country. Very deep economic crisis, no seeking phenomenon to speak of. And then the 1960s in this country, economic boom years. It doesn't align at all with an economic crisis, and yet you have it. And so there's no one-for-one cause. And so I only sort of had the space to think about what this particular one derives from. But absolutely, this is a recurring human pattern, which I think is, and there are books on the topic of people who try to take out these kind of what they call the more common terms, occultic milieu, and that's in the sort of anthropology of this phenomenon. To your first question, it is a finite amount of time in Russia for sure, and I think that the consolidation in the Putin era is an end. It's sort of the next phase of this country, which looks quite different. And the parallel with the current day in the United States, I mean, we don't have what I would call seeking phenomena. Maybe if we have, once the AI bubble bursts or whatever the next economic crisis is going to be, you might see this. It wouldn't surprise me, but we do have the underlying unsettled, kind of uneasy, probing questions circulating, and then problems of epistemic authority. And in the book, I don't, like I said, there's no Putin in the book. There's certainly no Trump in the book. But in interviews and articles and stuff I've been writing, that's what everyone wants to talk about, because it is such a, it does look like the current day in so many ways. And I mean, how easy is it to imagine in the near future, some, American patriot starts feeding documents of the early republic into a LLM, Aztec codices and shit manifests and Puritan sermons, and you just shove them into the anti-woke LLM, whatever, online. And then you produce some history, and it turns out that Slavs colonized America in the 14th century. And I think it would certainly find an audience. I mean, it's just so easy to imagine in our current moment. I think you could find an academic publisher. Maybe not NYU, but maybe go a couple of miles north of here.
I actually think that the semi-historians who are adjacent to the tech bros are doing this.
Yes.
They're already doing it, and they're drawing on the same sort of kind of over-investment in cultural over-investment in a particular form of prestige. They are tech prestige.
Yeah, that's
What do they call it? Big
neo-monarchists.
They call it big history
Yeah.
or something. Yeah.
There's all kind, yeah, it's definitely emerging out of the tech world, and the truth is, who in America has the authority to dispute it, right? So if some theory like this catches fire, there's certainly no academic authority who could convince anyone that it's not true. And so it's definitely the conditions are right for this sort of thing. And I think it's a much broader problem for the West. Yeah.
I mean, maybe relatedly, and with apologies for maybe imposing on your study a framework that is a little foreign to it, but you know, I'm a great fan of Ivan Zelinis and Georgi Conrad's Intellectuals on the Road to Class Power, which is a study of the intelligentsia class project in Eastern Europe in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in Perestroika, we have all these intellectuals going very public and playing a major role in open politics that is now possible, whether on the nationalist side, if you're in the republics, or on the kind of a Western-centric liberal side, if you're in Moscow.
Yeah.
And given that some of your characters, certainly not all, but you know, certainly for Menke, you know, maybe some of your astrologists and Hare Krishna are members of the intelligentsia. I wonder whether there is a story of a class, you know, obviously it would be intellectuals gone wrong, but whether there's a particular class story of the intellectual class project.
Absolutely, yeah, and the sociological markers of these seekers really are the urban mainstream, technical intelligentsia. But the one way that they actually differ from the average is they tend to be more educated. So these are a lot of people with higher educations, and I think that makes sense. I mean, the way that I think of it as sort of a class of the intellectual class is that in the 60s and 70s, 50s even, when the Soviet Union is ostensibly functioning and is investing so much in these people's education, and not just in education, but you know, there were very high quality journals popularizing science, popularizing history, really great reading material, good, if we think about India, films about yoga, and tons of translations of Indian texts that are being sold all over the place. And people are being encouraged by the state, very encouraged by the state to pursue meaning in kind of this world of ideas, and not just, you know, the upper echelons of the intelligentsia class, but engineers are supposed to be reading history and they're supposed to be interested in India. And so I think that they take this to heart. And then when the big picture starts to become less credible in the 1970s, and you see the, you know, uniting Soviet idea lose its purchase, all the same, these people are living in a Soviet world with Soviet resources, which are great, Soviet intellectual resources, and a Soviet worldview where they are exploring ideas, and that is how they're spending their free time. There is a very literate set of people, and so that class being sort of the most elevated, the most important to the Soviet project, and for that reason, the most disillusioned by the end, they're the ones who are then seeking the most aggressively for something new. Are there questions online?
Yeah, at the moment.
Hi, John Connolly.
Okay.
You know, I'm a journalist, so I'm always curious about facts. You mentioned
I'm sorry?
facts.
Oh,
I'm curious about facts.
Okay.
Yes, you know, some people listen. So you mentioned that Fomenko became, you know, widely popular, it got fame, and that, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people follow. It's nowhere close to the reality. Maybe there were, no, I lived there back then, and I was a journalist there with Moskovsky Notes. Who wrote about it? Fomenko became better known when Garry Kasparov, the famous chess champion, got interested in hip hop, and he started, sort of popularizing him. But flamenco was known in a very small circle of people, and a very small circles of people who were, interested in this peculiar view of history, especially since it was so nationalistically centered. The mathematical department of the Moscow State University was known as, among all other fundamental sciences, it was known as a very nationalistically minded group of people.
Yeah.
Second, you mentioned Hare Krishna once again, and I'm trying to figure out how many followers were there or had been there in Russia. Now, Vissarion, it's a very interesting issue. Of course, he's in jail now.
Yes.
Yes, but there are still, people who, there are a lot of criminal cases against him because he slept with girls, underage girls and all this kind of stuff. But he wasn't the only one. There were, I don't know how many people like Vissarion that turned up in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed, and for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
There was no foundation left. All of a sudden, people realized that they lived in the state which lied about everything and which killed their parents and grandparents. And all of a sudden, they realized that, even, my grandfather was shot on particular day, November 1, 1937. But, until I discovered his file in mid-90s, everybody believed in the family that he died out of pneumonia. And that was absolutely usual case in the Soviet Union. So of course, people were looking for something that could, give them some safety net. That's why Kashpirovsky, Chumакov, but I'm just curious, why do you pick Francis Vissarion? But not, there were women, amazing, what they were doing, and they were collecting hell of a lot of money. Vissarion also raised hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, so there were several apocalyptic sects, and none of them very big in number. I mean, Vissarion probably was 50,000 followers at his peak. People
Never.
reading it.
Never.
No, not in the settlements. In the settlements, 5,000 to 10,000 people. But not everybody who read his works and were invested in the centers all over the Union, watching the videos and listening to tapes of him were going to move. That was only a subset. So there were, but in any case, 50,000 people is not a huge number in a country this size. Astrology, certainly a mass phenomenon. The Hare Krishnas were highly visible beyond their actual numbers, but certainly people reading the Bhagavad Gita, people invested in yoga, people interested in Eastern currents were, the whole, it was a major current within this larger culture. And flamenco, I just have to disagree. I mean, just because it's difficult to reconstruct book sales, but over the 100 volumes and edited editions and so forth that they were publishing in the 90s, hundreds of thousands was the number I came to. And it doesn't mean that
Hundreds of thousands
of books of books sold. And certainly
these numbers. What is the source of your number?
well, I will
Yeah,
come speak to me afterwards, and I will,
yes,
yes,
please.
please.
Yeah.
But the prominence in bookshops and the fact that there was sort of in the center of the history section of the bookshop, these books were front and center, I know for certain, and that they were afforded pride of place above all history books in this period. Kasparov was definitely a shot in the arm for flamenco. So Garry Kasparov, for a brief period of time, decided that he'd also become, the historical authority because he read flamenco and he allied himself with flamenco. And then he drifted away when, for whatever reason, chess people, he's very erratic in his ideology. But he was a major booster. There were a few others. There were a few kind of erratic philosopher types that lasted on the flamenco, but it was by no means the only moment of fame for him. I mean, he was well known and people remember him very, very well to this day. But I can see that this is an urban phenomenon that it's happening in cities all across the Soviet Union, but my research is primarily in Moscow, some in Petersburg. Riga was a big center as well. The visibility of it in the sense that there were millions of people seeking all the time. There were these big fields where people would gather and exchange energy and books and things. How many of those people really changed their lives to adopt this, these worldviews is lost to history. What matters to me about them is that they are kind of the most visible and loudest expression of a much, much larger and broader cultural phenomenon. And so that's how I end up with these groups. Yeah.
Thank you so
Hello.
much, Millie. I came late, so I'm sorry if maybe you addressed this homeowner issue, but while you were speaking, and I've read your work, I was thinking actually, and again, like, maybe this is really weird, but I was thinking of Ben Nathan's book on dissidence. And one of the central arguments is that the dissidents, like, even though we might be tempted to think of them as outliers because they're so small in number, they're such minorities, that the movement was so small. Actually, for him, the argument is that they were not just Soviet people, but the most Soviet people, in the sense that they took the laws literally, they read them so literally, they took the state extremely seriously. Even though they were the minority, and super small. And I was actually thinking, in a way, that is it possible that the flamencos and the followers of these movements, small as they were, are they also in some ways like either the most Soviet people in a way, because they also, like, just in the distance, they came from the intelligentsia, they're hyper educated, they have like amazing Soviet biographies, or are they the least Soviet people? Because what they ended up doing is so different than what the dissidents.
No, I mean, I think they're thoroughly Soviet people, possessed of Soviet resources and ideas and Soviet worldview. Very few of them are anti-Soviet, and I hesitate to even call them un-Soviet, but the things they're doing, because most of them, especially as they're developing these ideas in the underground, there's no sense that they're certainly not dissidents. They're not anticipating the end of the state. This is sort of the Yurchak moment. The assumption is that this is just how it is, and it's going to be this way. And so they are pursuing their interests in a way that is entirely endorsed by the official line. I mean, you're supposed to develop your culture. The party platform uses the word duchovnost. You're supposed to be enriching yourself spiritually. And so they're absolutely Soviet. And I think in the aftermath in the 1990s, they are a really loud expression of what late Soviet culture was, for sure. Yeah. And that's even leaving aside what I said earlier about their sort of class and their position in Soviet society is really central.
Hey, I probably did not understand you. You're saying that state actually encouraged all these spiritual movements.
No, so the state, there's this amazing pattern, and you see this if you've read Julian First's work about the hippies. The state has this amazing capacity to produce its own opposition by fostering, so to return to India, huge amounts of culture and cultural resources dedicated to teaching people Sanskrit, sending journalists to India, embracing, opening institutes of Indian culture, translating these texts. But the truth is that ancient Indian texts, to separate sort of the cultural from the spiritual, is impossible. And so the fact that some of these people then come to take these ideas very seriously and make a spiritual worldview out of it was not at all the intention of the state. But it happens over and over again. The Hare Krishnas stand out because they actually were persecuted. So by the 1980s, the Hare Krishnas they faced a very aggressive crackdown. And they were imprisoned and they were forced into psychiatric institutions, if you can make that distinction. And so there they sort of took it too far. And the yoga movement as well. I mean, a lot of people doing yoga became very popular, but when yoga groups became overly formalized, they started to look like secret Hare Krishna cells, and so there were crackdowns. And so this pattern endures. I mean, the same with the astrologers. It all comes of Soviet culture, and it's sort of, they follow this intellectual path, and it's very logical from their starting point. But then the state is still saying this is pseudoscience, and this is not what it should be.
Could I say something about yoga, for example?
Yeah.
It was a little bit more complex. For example, yoga was encouraged as health movement
Yeah.
for health, because Soviet Union did not have enough technology, enough pharmacology and whatever. And it's kind of was easy way to tell people just be
That's
healthy.
sobriety and it's.
Yes,
Yeah, that's-
so it's, I can say much more, I won't, I
No.
won't, but it's a little bit, when you're on the ground in the Soviet Union, it's a little bit differently than what you.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, that they've set very clearly sort of the bounds of how they want people to think about yoga and appreciate it, and, you know, they have yogis coming and training the cosmonauts and, you know, bodily discipline and so forth, and they want it to stay there, for sure. It is not intended to be, a lifestyle or a spiritual thing, but it just happens inevitably, because yoga is, you know, there's a philosophy behind it, and people get invested in it. But that is not the intention, no. For sure. Please.
I wonder if you have any sort of information on these, on how these people that you're talking about, so this class of people, for example, that were seeking, and they were part of an urban sort of professional white collar, seems to be a class. And I wonder if you have any idea of what their situation was with respect to what you said at the beginning, the well-known fact about deaths of despair, etc. Are these the same people?
Yeah, the people who are hit hardest by the crisis, do you mean? So is there a kind of?
Are they hit hardest by? I mean,
No.
I probably white collar people are not.
No, they're not. That they are not, and it's definitely not.
I wonder if these are sort of cultural resources, for example, for them to overcome the collapse or these kinds of. I mean, there are sort of questions that might arise of
So there's
trying to figure out this population.
There's two parts to the answer, and one is that no, these are certainly not people hit hardest by the collapse. These are not people who are, you know, for instance, the droves of alcoholics who sort of drop out of society in that way. These are people who, by and large, you know, they're dislocated in employment. They definitely have their troubles in the 90s, but they're not in desperation. And that's true generally of converts and spiritual seeking. It doesn't typically come from a place of desperation, as I think people are quick to assume. But it's also a really well-established pattern of converts to downplay any kind of material reason for their conversion, to elevate the spiritual reasons for it. And so when you're speaking to somebody who has adopted a really firm worldview, they'll almost never tell you that, you know, how bad their life was at the time, because the idea is that they came to it of their own free will and for spiritual reasons. And so it's difficult to reconstruct, and I tried this, but by oral history, it was difficult to really determine how the economic crisis and the material crisis of these individuals related to their beliefs. And that's something you probably determine better by textual study than by video. Yeah. Good questions. They are going to sell, they were going to sell books. And
Yes, they should be here soon.
they're too expensive those. Thank you very much.
Email.
There's just a
Yeah, there's gonna be.
5 minutes ago. So
Yeah.
Please.